Hello and welcome to Module 6 of Effective Professional Development, in which we'll be hoping to gain an insight into adult behaviour change. Here's our session overview. We'll have a quick recap of what we've covered in the programme so far, then think about why we're talking about behaviour change. We'll look at some models of behaviour change and some barriers to sustaining change, and then some next steps and gap tasks. Now, throughout this video, there are going to be points at which I ask you to pause and to complete a task. So it'll take approximately an hour to complete the module. The video will be about half an hour, the whole module about 1 hour. And to support you with that, I'd really like you to preload this YouTube link, because I'll be asking you to watch that in a second. And also these two other resources. So the Behaviour Insights Team East publication, and also the East Evaluation Grid. So if you just pause the video here and make sure you've got all of that ready to go, and we can make best use of our time. Okay, welcome back. Before we go any further, we're going to have a quick recap on what the evidence suggests are the best bets for successful professional development with lasting impact. So we've looked in detail at the mechanisms, these building blocks of professional development. And a core message from the EEF's Effective Professional Development Guidance Report is that when we're planning our PD, or if we're reviewing a programme that we might want to adopt in our schools, we need to carefully consider alignment with these mechanisms, each of which has a strong evidence base that suggests impact on improved efficacy for our staff. And the research further suggests that the more of these mechanisms that we can include in our PD, the greater the impact. And even if our professional development cannot include all 14 mechanisms, we've looked at the importance of a balanced design, including mechanisms from each of the 4 categories of building knowledge, motivating teachers, developing teacher techniques, and embedding practice. And this visual makes clear the risk if we miss out any of these 4 categories. So it might be helpful for you just to pause and review those here, though of course you can also find them summarised in the guidance report on page 27. So moving on, why are we talking about behaviour change? How does that link? What's the link between professional development and behaviour change? Well, PD is all about changing behaviour. Whether we're introducing a new homework policy, asking teachers to adapt their assessment within a lesson, or adopting a new curriculum, it's all about change. And so, in addition to the mechanisms, it might also be helpful to consider how we can influence behaviour change and what evidence we can draw on beyond the realm of education. We're going to return to this Vivian Robinson quote, and I'll just let you read through that. And I'll draw your attention to this central assertion. The hardest part of change is its implementation. And that's why we really need to think about behaviour change and change in general. It's hard to change the smallest of habits, never mind an array of concurrent changes. The importance of hand hygiene and hand washing in hospitals is a useful analogy for the complexity of change, in that nearly 200 years after the evidence emerged of its efficacy, and up until the COVID pandemic, it remained a really hard behaviour to change. The notion that millions of lives have been saved from the last century from hand washing is a fair estimate. However, these tales of victory actually hide the reality that something seemingly as simple and established in public health still isn't, or wasn't, implemented consistently in hospitals. The evidence cited here, Wilson et al. From 2011, shows that simply training has not sustained compliance in hospitals. Other interventions, such as eliciting peer pressure, the importance of role models, incorporating opinion leaders, and then culture-changing interventions that combine multiple threads to nudge and sustain behaviour change, are necessary. Effectively, changing one small habit of a lifetime or a career requires more support than we often assume. Now, in a second, I'm going to ask you to watch this short video on YouTube. That's the link that I shared with you at the beginning. And this is from American academics Chip and Dan Heath, and they're the author of this book, Switch: How to Change When Change is Hard. And we're going to hear the main thesis of their argument in this short video. So pause this video and head over to that YouTube link. Okay, welcome back. So the key message from that video is that we need to find the emotion, put feeling first when we're trying to foster change in others and obtain buy-in for our professional development initiatives. Later on in the book, the authors use the analogy of the elephant and the rider. The rider is our conscious, rational brain. The elephant is our emotional, instinctive side of our brain, and we need to combine the two to achieve change. The rider, our conscious, rational brain, analyzes, plans, solves problems, and the rider needs clear instruction and direction. They need to know where they're going, but the rider alone cannot complete the journey. And as I said before, the elephant in this analogy represents the emotional, instinctive part of our brain. And we can see here that the elephant is bigger, stronger, more powerful. It provides the fuel, the power to drive the journey. The rider can try to lead the elephant, but because of that power, the rider will struggle to shift the elephant unless the elephant wants to shift. So a key part of our motivation is finding the ways to make the elephant want to move, finding that emotional connection. Now, the third stage here, the third message here is about shaping the path, about taking obstacles away. So an analogy might be a fallen tree across the path. The analogy there might be that a staff meeting gets cancelled for whatever reason. How do we make sure that we make that journey as straightforward as possible? And we'll look a bit more of that a bit later. Now, a way of engaging with our staff emotion is to ensure that we have clearly articulated how our professional development aligns with school priorities and how that in turn is going to improve pupils' experiences. This is the why for most teachers. We need to start with this why and align our PD with teachers' moral purpose, making things better for children and young people, especially those suffering from disadvantage in all its many guises. Here's a modelled example of what I mean, and here I'm exemplifying this mechanism 8 of modelling the technique. I'm going to read that aloud. Our school values talk about excellence and equality of opportunity. However, we know that the achievement of our pupils with SEND is significantly below the national averages. At the moment, for a whole host of reasons, we simply aren't doing a good enough job for these pupils. And some of those reasons are beyond our control, but there are some things that are within our power to change, and we're going to focus on those to ensure we're giving our pupils the very best opportunity to succeed. Now, I've chosen this example because I think it works for a whole range of staff in our schools. This might be used in CPD with teachers about inclusive teaching strategies. We might use it with teaching assistants about effective use of scaffolds. We might use it with SENCOs and pastoral teams about acceptable adaptations to behaviour policies and practices. And we might use it with our office staff when we are generating buy-in around improving systems for referrals and record keeping and managing communications with parents. And this example sets out very clearly the why. It links closely to the school values, the mission, what we want our pupils to have and to have achieved by the time they leave us. And we're making a real link here to the actions and the impact of our actions on our pupils. We're not blaming. We know that some of the underlying causes are beyond our control, but it's a real call to action to focus on those things that are within our power to change. Now, of course, it may sound a little bit robotic and you won't want to deliver this as a script to your staff bodies. However, the very process of scripting and articulating our why, makes it really clear in our own minds. What is it that we're really wanting to say? What is our clear and compelling vision for doing this piece of CPD and this piece of CPD now? So I'd like you to pause the video here and go to your PD plan. And again, you can find all those resources in the usual place. And to draft the purpose, what is the why? And we'll be sharing these at our next session. You can see the link here with mechanism 10, rehearsing the technique. So pause the video here, spend some time drafting that clear and compelling purpose, and then we'll regroup after that. Welcome back. So, of course, what we are talking about here is motivation, and we can see the clear link here with category B, motivating teachers. And this is huge and underpins everything. The mechanisms are vitally important, but they're not sufficient. Handily, there is evidence out there from beyond the realm of education that we can draw on to help us to motivate teachers to make change. And before we look at that, I'm just going to unpick a bit what I mean by important but not sufficient. These three specific mechanisms, setting and agreeing on goals, presenting information from a credible source, and providing affirmation and reinforcement after progress, those are really important, but they're not going to help us do all of that work around motivation. We need to look beyond, and as I say, evidence elsewhere. And so with the proviso that all models are wrong, but some are useful, we're now going to look at a couple of models of behaviour change. And the first of these is the COM-B model. And this shows how capability, opportunity, and motivation can combine to influence behaviour change. Let's see what we mean by each of those. So capability, and I've put those links to our categories of mechanisms around building knowledge, developing teacher techniques. These are typically about the individual. How capable are the people undertaking the change? Do they understand the problem? And are they knowledgeable about their domains? And this is really where our PD design will come in. How are we effectively building this knowledge? And a useful example of the challenge here might be to think about this in the context of the early career framework. We know that early career teachers have different starting points depending on their training routes, their previous experience, and their existing knowledge and skills. However, in order to achieve the consistency of outcome, every ECT's training follows the same curriculum to build their knowledge and develop their techniques. Likewise, with our staff in mentoring and line management roles, do they have the knowledge of effective coaching, of best practice, and of all of our trust policies in their domain? Do they know, for example, how to manage difficult conversations? So this will be the starting point for some of our PD design work. Moving on to opportunity, this will typically be about our organisation. So this might be starting small. That might be a department or a phase. It might be our whole school. It might be a local authority or our trust. How much opportunity do people have to familiarise themselves with the change that we are asking them to enact? How much upfront CPD? How much follow-on coaching? How much time? And time is absolutely of the essence. How much opportunity do they have to practice the change through peer observation, weekly reflections, follow-on CPD? What are the organisational supports in place? And if we return to that analogy of the early career framework, have our mentors and our ECTs been given sufficient time off timetable to engage with coaching effectively and to complete their online learning? And if we move on to motivation, this is typically about our cultures. How motivated is the person making the change? Have they been through this many times before? Have they seen lots of failed initiatives? And how might that undermine the change that we're trying to make? How wedded are they to the existing practice? Now, it might be that you're trying to change something that's really quite unpopular. It might be that staff are ready to embrace a change to appraisal systems or to homework practices, and that will make that motivation piece much easier. However, if we're trying to change a popular existing practice, we're going to need to work a bit harder at that motivating piece. And crucially, and linking back to our clear and compelling vision, is the change aligned to teacher beliefs? And that might be teacher beliefs about who they are and who they aspire to be as educators. Is there a conflict there? Is there cognitive dissonance? How can we help them align those two? So we're coming to our second task, and we've got a couple of scenarios here, one more for teacher-facing staff and one for those staff who are working more in administrative and managerial roles. Scenario A, you have introduced a reading slot during form time. An active ingredient, a core part, an essential element of that is that all form teachers read aloud to their class. Or scenario B, you've introduced a new appraisal system across all schools. And an active ingredient of that is that all staff self-evaluate their performance against a rubric. So using that COM-B framework, I'd like you to think, what do you need to consider to ensure that either scenario or scenario B, your new innovation is your new initiative is successful and achieved by all staff? What capability do you need to ensure? What's the opportunity? And what's going to be the motivation? So I'd like you to pause here and reflect on the scenario that you've chosen and what actions you might need to plan to ensure that your staff have the capability, opportunity, and motivation to achieve behaviour change. And again, we'll be sharing these at our next session, so please be sure to complete them. Okay, I hope you found that useful. We're now going to move on to consider another model, and this allows us to dig deeper into the M, the motivation part of the COM-B model. Now, the EAST model was developed by the Behavioural Insights team. That was established by David Cameron to develop strategies for behaviour change, or nudge theory. This is things like putting the fruit and vegetables by the door of the supermarket to get people to buy more of those, or removing sweets from checkout tills, or moving towards opt-out pension schemes rather than opt-in. And the EAST model suggests that to support people to change their behaviour, we need to make that change easy to enact, an attractive proposition, a change that harnesses social norms, and one that is timely in its communication. Now, this report is available with your programme resources, and I'd particularly recommend that you read the executive summary on pages 4 to 7. There is an example here of how a small nudge can have a really significant impact. And the initiative being evaluated here is around parents being sent text messages to remind them about tests and homework. And when this happened, pupils' test results improved. Here you can see the outcome. So a large study, if you look at the underlined section, 16,000 students across 36 secondary schools. And we can see in that bottom paragraph that this intervention improved maths results by the equivalent of an extra month in the classroom and had a small positive effect on attendance. However, it's really important that we bring our criticality to this study. No statistically significant effects were found in English and science, but a useful example of a small nudge producing a significant result. Let's look a bit more closely at each of these elements. If we look at E first, making it easy. So starting with harnessing the power of defaults, we have a strong tendency to go with the default or the preset option, since it is easy to do so. Making an option the default makes it more likely to be adopted. Reducing the hassle factor of taking up a service. The effort required to perform an action often puts people off. Reducing this effort required can increase uptake. And simplifying our messages. Making the message clear often results in a significant increase in response rates to communications. In particular, it's useful to identify how a complex goal can be broken down into simpler, easier actions. If we think back to our example of teacher reading aloud, the hassle factor could be reduced by giving teachers a suggested reading list and providing the books. And it might be that this is part of a wider strategy to improve reading fluency. And so rather than giving teachers a range of ways to develop fluent reading, we might ask them simply to read aloud for 15 minutes 3 times a week. So we've reduced the hassle factor and we've simplified the message. Moving on to A, making it attractive. Now, for most teachers, improved pupil outcomes will be the main rewards. But making it attractive can help as well. And for example, presenting teachers with a collection of 6 beautiful new books for their read aloud sessions could also maximise buy-in, especially if these align with those teacher beliefs around, for example, the need for a more diverse curriculum. Moving on to making it social. We can aim to show that most people perform the desired behaviour. Describing what most people do in a particular situation encourages others to do the same. Similarly, policymakers should be wary of inadvertently reinforcing a problematic behaviour by emphasising its high prevalence. For example, after our reading pilot, we might email everyone to say, thank you so much, everyone, for your fantastic feedback around our reading scheme, really communicating that people are buying into it and it's having an impact. The second bullet point here is using that power of networks. We're all embedded in a network of social relationships, and those we come into contact with shape our actions. So really thinking about who we might pilot initiatives with, but with those keen beams, with those people who will champion the work, those people who are then going to be able to feed back positive stories to the rest of our network. And encouraging people to make a commitment both to others and to themselves. And we often use commitment devices to voluntarily lock ourselves into doing something in advance. And the social nature of these commitments is often crucial. Returning to our example here, asking teachers to share with each other which books have been particularly successful in our read aloud. And then our last part of the acronym, the T, making it timely. We're really thinking about the timing of our communications, prompting people when they are likely to be most receptive. The same offer made at different times can have drastically different levels of success. And behaviour is generally easier to change when habits are already disrupted, such as around major life events. Now, the start of term might be a good idea. An example here, before we've all settled into our routines and our habits, an opportunity to disrupt or introduce a new initiative. Interestingly, some evidence around the return from lockdown as well was a time when schools were able to enact change. Considering the immediate costs and benefits, and those might be financial cost and benefits, but how can we adjust these? They might be time costs and benefits as well. If, returning to our example, around reading aloud, if we're asking teachers to do reading aloud for 15 minutes every 3 days, what can we take out of the curriculum for them? And how can we demonstrate a benefit of that action? And then helping people plan their response. We know that there's a gap between attentions and actual behaviour, and we can see a clear link here with some of our action planning mechanisms from professional development. A proven solution here is to prompt people to identify the barriers to those actions and then develop specific plans to address them. So really thinking about that pre-mortem work as well. What could go wrong here? What might be the barriers? And how can we plan to mitigate those? Now, there is a template here available in your resources, which you may not be in a position to use right now, but I will flag it to you for when you're a bit further along with your plans, which is really a small evaluation tool to really think about the professional development that you're planning and how have you made it easy, attractive, social, and timely. Ways in which your plans will do that, what the potential barriers might be, the levels of risk around those, and what you're going to do about those. So just to flag that resource is available to you when you are ready to use it. So we're moving on to the last part of this session, which is really thinking about the challenges to long-term change. Now, it's a truism to say that schools are busy, complex places which can throw up barriers to change. And so it's worth considering some of these so that we can plan our response, some of that pre-mortem work. Now, we've got here some challenges to long-term sustained change in schools. Thinking about teacher turnover, how can we mitigate the risk of losing institutional knowledge? What the gaps in our teacher knowledge might be, and thinking, for example, with the introduction of the early career framework, we might have really well-trained teachers in years 1 and 2, but what about our teachers who did not go through that process? What might their gaps be? Have we provided sufficient training, and not just for teachers, but for all of our staff, so that they're really clear about expectations, processes, and policies? Unclear communications, again, making sure that our communications are not overly burdensome, but that our staff really understand our expectations. Changing priorities, how can we make sure that we hold fast to the things that we've identified? And that links very clearly with those competing demands. And then back to that really clear link with our motivation piece of work. What are the competing teacher and leader beliefs? So I'd like you to pause here just to consider, in your setting with the group of staff that you are working with, what are the top 3 barriers for your work at the moment? Or is there something else that's not here? So just pause for a few minutes and think, what are the top 3 barriers to long-term sustained change in your setting? Okay, welcome back. We're going to walk through some potential solutions here. And again, although this flags teachers specifically, this is broadly true of all our staff. If we know that staff turnover, that loss of institutional knowledge, is a challenge, have we got really clear routines for induction in place for our central teams, for our central services, for our teachers, for our teaching assistants, for all staff, so that they understand all of our policies, processes, and expectations? If we're thinking about gaps in knowledge linked with insufficient training, again, back to the C in our COM-B model, does our PD meet our staff at their starting points? We're not making assumptions about what they already know, and therefore leaving those gaps in their knowledge, but understanding where they are, what their needs are, so that our PD can be really accurately targeted. Are we really clearly communicating? Have we got a comms plan? If we're making a change and our CPD is driving that change, at what points are we communicating, and what are our timeframes? If we're thinking that this is a change that we're going to be sustaining over the course of the year, what are the different messages that we need to communicate at different points? Have we planned those all out in advance so that with the hurly-burly of school life, the communication isn't swept aside or lost along the way? And of course, links really clearly there with those competing demands and changing priorities. Now we can set ourselves up for success by making sure that that the CPD is really driving our school development plan priorities. We've identified those priorities by looking at the evidence from our own schools and across our settings and your clusters. And by making sure that those are holding fast to those identified priorities, we can maximise our chances of success. And if we're thinking about those competing teacher and leader beliefs about getting buy-in around staff buying, we're back to that motivation, starting with the why. Why are we doing this? And using evidence to support. And that's not just the external evidence base, the external research base, but the evidence of our own settings. Our data, our student attainment data, and that will be both statutory and internal data. It might be what we've learned from lesson observations, from learning walks, from book looks. It might be what we've learned from qualitative data, from staff interviews and surveys, from pupil interviews and surveys, and from focus groups and interviews, and including in that stakeholders from the broader school community, our governors, our trustees, and our parents. So that we can really make sure, if we identify those barriers, we can really address them head on and mitigate the risk. Okay, we've come to the end of this session. So I'm going to ask you to go back to your reflective journal and really jot down the sort of new or deepened learning from this session, some key reflections and some next steps. And I've put some prompt questions there, which I hope are useful to you. Again, this isn't a sort of an accountability model. This is for you to use in a way that is useful for your department, your school, your cluster. What do you need to consider regarding the barriers to staff development? What are the specific behavioural changes that you're expecting, and what might inhibit those? And how does the COMBI model help you to identify or reconsider in your plan as important factors for staff development? So before we finish off the session, I'm going to invite you to pause here and complete your notes in that reflective journal. Okay, thank you very much for listening to this video and for engaging with those tasks within the session. We have now a task for beyond the session, which is this gap task that we would like you to complete in advance of our next live session, and really pinning down and articulating as clearly as you can, what is the school development priority that your PD is seeking to support? What is the problem? Now, it's early on in the school year. It might not be that the professional development, school development plan has been pinned down and that those priorities have been identified. That's fine. Have a go at this as an academic exercise, as a practice exercise, as a way of rehearsing the technique. Again, back to mechanism 10. And you might want to use that as something that you're seeing coming up on the horizon that you're going to want to complete. You might want to sort of think about it retrospectively, thinking about a school development priority that you've been working on this year, and thinking, how could you clearly articulate that so that when you are ready to go with this, when you're ready to go, when those priorities have been clearly identified, maybe for next academic year, you're in the habit and in the routine of articulating that. So that's the gap task. And again, I'm going to ask you to bring that along with some of the session tasks to share at points in our next session. So please do make sure that those have been completed as an act of generosity to others, so that we can all share and build each other's knowledge and draw on each other's expertise, but also to really help you clearly articulate and think through each stage of the plan. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to meeting you again at our next session. Bye-bye.